Adding to the destruction following Hurricane Katrina, fires burn in parts of New Orleans in an apocalyptic scene from early on September 3, 2005. The storm struck the Gulf Coast with devastating force at daybreak on August 29, 2005, pummeling a region that included Hurricane Katrina explained. Hurricane Katrina was the costliest storm in U.S. history, and its effects are still felt today in New Orleans and coastal Louisiana. By Sarah Gibbons. Louisiana on August 29, 2005. It hit land as a Category 3 storm with winds reaching speeds as high as 120 miles per hour. Because of the ensuing destruction and loss of life, the storm is often considered one of the worst in U.S. history. An estimated 1,200 people died as a direct result of the storm, which also cost an estimated $108 billion in property damage, making it the costliest storm on record. The devastating aftermath of Hurricane Katrina exposed a series of deep-rooted problems, including controversies over the federal government's response, difficulties in search and rescue efforts, and lack of preparedness for the storm, particularly with regard to the city's aging series of levees, 50 of which failed during the storm, significantly flooding the low-lying city and causing much of the damage. Katrina's victims tended to be low-income and African American in disproportionate numbers, and many of those who lost their homes faced years of hardship. 10 years after the disaster, then President Barack Obama said of Katrina, "What started out as a natural disaster became a man-made disaster, a failure of government to look out for its own citizens." Significantly altered more than a decade after the storm, both physically and culturally. The damage was so extensive that some pundits had argued controversially that New Orleans should be permanently abandoned, even as the city vowed to rebuild. The population of New Orleans fell by more than half in the year after Katrina, according to Data Research Center. As of this writing, the population had grown back to nearly 80% of where it was before the storm. Timeline of the storm. Katrina first formed as a tropical depression in Caribbean waters near the Bahamas on August 23, 2005. It officially reached hurricane status 2 days later when it passed over southeastern Miami as a Category 1 storm. The tempest blew through Miami at 80 miles per hour, where it uprooted trees and killed 2 people. Katrina then weakened to a tropical storm, since hurricanes require warm ocean water to sustain speed and strength and begin to weaken over land. However, the storm then crossed back into the Gulf of Mexico, where it quickly regained strength and hurricane status. Hurricanes 101. Hurricanes are the most powerful storms known to man. Find out when hurricane season peaks, how the storms form, and the surprising role they play in the larger global ecosystem. On August 29th, the storm grew to a Category 3 hurricane. At its largest, Katrina was so wide its diameter stretched across the Gulf of Mexico. Before the storm hit land, a mandatory evacuation was issued for the city of New Orleans, which had a population of more than 480,000 at the time. Tens of thousands of residents fled, but many stayed, particularly among the city's poorest residents and those who were elderly or lacked access to transportation. Many sheltered in their homes or made their way to the Superdome, the city's largest sports arena, where conditions would soon deteriorate into hardship and chaos. New Orleans was spared as most of the storm's initial impacts battered the coast toward the east near Biloxi, Mississippi, where winds were the strongest and damage was extensive. But later that morning, a levee broke in New Orleans, and a surge of floodwater began pouring into the low-lying city. The waters would soon overwhelm additional levees. The following day, Katrina weakened to a tropical storm, but severe flooding inhibited relief efforts in much of New Orleans. An estimated 80% of the city was soon underwater. By September 2nd, 4 days later, the city and surrounding areas were in full-on crisis mode, with many people and companion animals still stranded, and infrastructure and services collapsing. Congress issued $10 billion for disaster relief aid, while much of the world began criticizing the U.S. government's response. The region sits in a natural basin, and some of the city is below sea level, so is particularly prone to flooding. Low-income communities tend to be in the lowest lying areas. Just south of the city, the powerful Mississippi River flows into the Gulf of Mexico. During intense hurricanes, oncoming storms can push seawater onto land, creating what is known as a storm surge. These forces typically cause the most hurricane-related fatalities. As Hurricane Katrina hit, New Orleans and surrounding parishes saw record storm surges as high as 19 feet. Katrina then and now. With aid from the outside and a convoy of trucks to distribute food, water, and supplies to those still at the convention center. Levees. Levees can be natural or manufactured. They are essentially walls that prevent waterways from overflowing and flooding nearby areas. New Orleans has been protected by levees since the French began inhabiting the region in the 17th century, but modern levees were authorized for construction in 1965 after Hurricane Betsy flooded much of the city. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers then built a complex system of 350 miles of levees. Yet a report by the Corps released in 2006 concluded that insufficient funding, information, and poor construction had led to the flood system vulnerable to failure. Even before Katrina made landfall off the Gulf, the incoming storm surge had started to overwhelm the levees, spilling into residential city of New Orleans. Such as downed trees and buildings, studies conducted in the years since concluded that failed levees accounted for the worst impacts and most deaths. The aftermath. An assessment from the state of Louisiana confirmed that just under half of the 1,200 deaths resulted from chronic disease exacerbated by the storm, and a third of the deaths were from drowning. Hurricane death tolls were debated, and for Katrina, counts can vary by as much as 600. Collected bodies must be examined for cause of death, and some argue that indirect hurricane deaths, like being unable to access medical care, should be counted in official numbers. Hurricane Katrina was the costliest in U.S. history and left widespread economic impacts. Oil and gas industry operations were crippled after the storm, and coastal communities that rely on tourism suffered from both loss of infrastructure and business and coastal erosion. An estimated 400,000 people were permanently displaced by the storm. Demographic shifts followed in the wake of the hurricane. The city is also now more racially diverse, with higher numbers of Latino and Asian residents, while a disproportionate number of African Americans found it too difficult to return. Rebuilding part of New Orleans' hurricane defenses cost $14.6 billion and was completed in 2018. More flood systems are pending construction, meaning the city is still at risk from another large storm. A series of flood walls, levees, and floodgates buttress the coast and banks of the Mississippi River. Simulations modeled in the years after Katrina suggest that the storm may have been made worse by rising sea levels and warming temperatures. Scientists are concerned that hurricanes the size of Katrina will become more likely as the climate warms. Studies are increasingly showing that climate change makes hurricanes capable of carrying more moisture. At the same time, hurricanes are moving more slowly, spending more time deluging areas unprepared for major flooding.